All right, so you ready to like jump into the world of fighter jets and, international relations?
Always ready for that.
Yeah, me too. So you sent me these really interesting articles about India's Air Force, and they're trying to modernize. But
Yes.
it seems like it's a lot more complicated than just, going shopping for a new plane, right?
Oh, yeah. Way more to it's not just about, picking out a shiny new jet. You've got to think about, India's strategic needs, their economic goals and their relationships with all the major players like, the US, Russia, China.
Right, right. It's like all tangled up together.
It is, exactly. It all feeds into, these big decisions that they're making about their whole fighter jet program.
Okay. Well, speaking of big decisions, one of these articles from the Economic Times has a pretty dramatic headline. It says, F-35 buzz in India. Air Chief AP Singh says, not so fast. It's not like buying a washing machine. So President Trump offered India F-35s.
Right.
Is this a game changer or what? Well, it's definitely created a lot of buzz. And, Air Chief Marshal AP Singh, he kind of hit the nail on the head when he said this isn't a simple purchase.
Yeah.
There's so much more to it. For one thing, there isn't even a formal proposal yet from the U.S. It's just an offer. And then there's the price tag. We're talking $80 million per jet.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's not, your average impulse buy.
No, not at all.
So I guess when you're talking about, fifth generation fighters, you're paying for some pretty serious technology, but maybe you could break down for us, like, what exactly makes a fifth generation fighter so special?
Okay, so fifth generation aircraft, they're not just, about looking cool. They represent this, like, huge leap in capability.
Okay.
So we're talking about stealth technology that makes them like incredibly difficult to detect on radar. And then there's advanced sensor fusion, giving pilots an unprecedented level of situational awareness.
Wow.
And then you've got network-centric warfare capabilities that allow them to like seamlessly share information with other aircraft and ground forces so they can all like talk to each other.
Exactly. Yeah, think of it like going from a flip phone to like a supercomputer in your pocket.
Okay, yeah, I get it. So these F-35s, they're like the Ferraris of the fighter jet world.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
But does India really need, a whole fleet of supercars? Like, what's the situation with their current Air Force?
Well, their current fleet, it's facing some serious challenges. Like a lot of their planes are getting old, they're aging, and the number of operational squadrons is actually shrinking.
Oh, wow.
And then meanwhile, China, their neighbor, and I mean, let's be honest, probably their biggest rival, strategically, they've been like aggressively modernizing their own Air Force.
Yeah, right.
Like over the past decade, China added 435 new, fighter and ground attack aircraft to their fleet, but India's fleet actually decreased by 151.
Wow, those numbers are pretty startling. I mean, it sounds like a potentially dangerous imbalance, of power there.
Yeah. It is a major concern for India, and this isn't just about like, keeping up appearances. It's about having, the actual military strength to deter potential aggression.
Right.
And defend their interests.
Right, they share that huge and often contested border with China.
Exactly. And that border is, it's a source of constant tension.
Yeah, so if India needs to modernize and kind of quickly, why not just, buy a bunch of new jets off the shelf?
Yeah.
Why is this such a tough decision?
Well, it really boils down to India's vision for their future. They're not content with just being a buyer of military hardware. They want to become a major defense producer, in their own right. And that's where this Make in India initiative comes in.
Right, Make in India. We hear that term a lot, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the specifics.
Yeah.
Can you kind of give us the rundown?
Sure. Make in India, it's basically this huge push to boost domestic manufacturing in India, encouraging companies to set up shop within their borders. It's like a massive economic project.
Oh.
And it ties directly into, their defense ambitions. They want to build their own, fighter jets, their own tanks, their own warships, like become self-reliant when it comes to defense technology.
Wow, that's super ambitious.
Yeah.
I mean, is that realistic? I mean, designing and building these advanced fighter jets, it's so complex and expensive.
It's a long-term goal, for sure, and they've definitely faced some challenges along the way. Like, for example, their homegrown Tejas fighter jet program that's experienced, delays and cost overruns.
All right.
And they are working on this more advanced, Tejas Mark II, which promises, like, significant improvements, but it's still under development.
Okay, so Make in India, it's like a great aspiration for the long term, but does it really solve their immediate need to, like, replace these aging aircraft?
Yeah.
And counter, China's growing air power, right?
That's exactly right.
So is that where this F-35 offer kind of comes back into the picture, as like a temporary fix until they can get their own production lines, up and running?
It's a possibility, but even if India decides they want the F-35, it's not just like a simple plug-and-play solution, you know? Like,
Yeah.
imagine trying to fit a Ferrari engine into a, like a classic car.
I can't even picture that.
Yeah, it would be a mess. Integrating the F-35 into the Indian Air Force, I mean, it would be a logistical nightmare.
Oh, wow.
They would have to, like, overhaul their maintenance systems, retrain all their pilots, potentially even modify their air bases just to accommodate these, high-tech jets.
Yeah. And I imagine there's the whole issue of relying on the U.S., for spare parts and technical support. I mean, that creates a whole other set of, strategic vulnerabilities,
Right.
especially if relations between the two countries, get rocky down the road.
You're hitting on a really important point there. India has traditionally maintained this certain level of strategic independence by diversifying, their arms suppliers. They get weapons from lots of different countries.
Right.
So relying too heavily on the U.S. for, such a critical part of their defense, that could raise some serious concerns about, their autonomy.
Right. Yeah. Makes them kind of dependent in a way.
It does, exactly.
And then let's not forget that cost factor. I mean, it's not just the $80 million per jet.
Right.
It's all the ongoing maintenance expenses.
Oh, absolutely.
And this article mentioned that the F-35 currently has an availability rate of only 51% in the U.S. Air Force.
Yeah.
I mean, to put that into perspective, that means like almost half the time these super expensive jets are grounded for maintenance.
Yeah, that's a pretty staggering statistic, and it really highlights, the hidden costs of operating a piece of, military hardware that is sophisticated. You're not just paying for the plane itself, you're paying for this whole support infrastructure.
Yeah.
Specialized parts, highly trained technicians, it all adds up.
It's like the iceberg. You only see the tip, when you're looking at the price tag of the jet itself.
Exactly.
Okay, so even if this F-35 seems like, a dream on paper, it comes with some serious baggage. Logistical challenges, strategic dependencies, and those hefty price tags. So it sounds like India's fighter jet dilemma, it's a lot more complex than just, choosing the coolest plane on the market.
Absolutely. You've got, it's this fascinating case study in how, national security and economic goals and even like technological aspirations, how they all intersect,
Right, right.
And it's only going to get more interesting as we delve into India's relationships with, other major players in the region like Pakistan.
Oh, yeah, Pakistan. I knew we couldn't have this conversation about India's security without bringing them into it.
Oh, of course not. It's all connected.
And it seems like the U.S. has thrown like a real curveball into this whole mix.
They have, wait till you hear about the F-16s.
Okay, well, now I really want to hear about the F-16s. It's getting good.
Yeah.
All right, so we're back, and I'm ready to hear all about this F-16 situation with Pakistan. I mean, it seems like just when we think we've got a handle on, India's fighter jet dilemma, there's like another twist in the story.
Oh, it's definitely like a, real-life geopolitical thriller, isn't it?
Yeah.
Remember how the U.S., cut off aid to Pakistan a few years back?
Right, right. They were, criticizing them for supporting terrorist groups and all that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, now they've decided to provide funding to maintain Pakistan's fleet of F-16 fighter jets.
Say, really? That seems like a total 180 from their previous stance.
Eh.
Didn't President Trump, publicly criticize Pakistan for supporting terrorist groups and halt all that security assistance? And now they're back to supporting their fighter jet program?
It definitely seems like a head scratcher, at first glance, but I think it makes a little more sense when you consider, the long and complicated history between the U.S. and Pakistan.
Right. They've been allies and rivals and kind of everything in between.
Exactly. Yeah. It's always been this, delicate balancing act influenced by Pakistan's strategic location and their role in the fight against terrorism and, of course, their, often rocky relationship with India.
Right, right. India and Pakistan have had their own share of conflicts over the years, and that tension always seems to be simmering, just below the surface.
Absolutely. So when the U.S. announces they're going to help maintain Pakistan's F-16s, it's bound to raise some eyebrows in New Delhi.
Yeah, especially since one of those F-16s was allegedly involved in that aerial skirmish with India back in 2019. Remember, we talked about that earlier.
Exactly. That incident definitely adds to the sensitivity of this whole issue, The U.S. is trying to downplay it, saying the funding is strictly for, counterterrorism efforts, that Pakistan needs these jets to fight militant groups within their borders. But that explanation isn't really sitting well with India.
I can imagine why. I mean, it sounds like they see it as kind of a double standard, with the U.S. bolstering Pakistan's military capabilities while simultaneously trying to, woo India as a strategic partner.
Yeah, that's exactly the dilemma. The U.S. is trying to juggle all these competing interests in the region. They want to maintain a working relationship with Pakistan, mainly because of their, strategic importance in the fight against terrorism and their influence in neighboring Afghanistan.
But they also don't want to push India away because they're a rising economic and military power and a key player in their, Indo-Pacific strategy to counter China.
Well, exactly. It's like this classic geopolitical balancing act, and this F-16 decision has really, put those competing interests front and center.
It makes you wonder if the U.S. has really thought through, the long-term consequences of this move. They might be trying to achieve some short-term objectives in Pakistan, but they risk damaging their strategic partnership with India in the process.
Yeah, it's a valid concern, and it highlights, how important it is to take a long-term strategic view in foreign policy. Decisions made in one area can have, ripple effects across the globe.
So what's India's play in all of this? I mean, they're facing this growing military gap with China. They're struggling to get their, domestic fighter jet production off the ground. They've got this F-35 offer from the U.S., and now their rival Pakistan is getting a boost from the U.S. as well. It's a tough spot to be in.
It's a real geopolitical quagmire,
Right.
and it forces India to tread very carefully. They don't want to overreact and jeopardize their relationship with the U.S., but they also can't just sit back and ignore the potential threat posed by a, strengthened Pakistani Air Force.
So what are their options? How do they play this?
Well, one option is to, continue to press the U.S. for more transparency on the F-16 funding. They could also seek assurances that, those jets won't be used against them. Another option is to try to use this situation to, extract concessions from the U.S., maybe in terms of technology sharing or deeper defense cooperation.
So it's like a potential bargaining chip in their negotiations with you.
It could be, but they have to play it smart. They don't want to push the U.S. too far and risk driving them closer to Pakistan or damaging the overall relationship.
It's all about finding that right balance, isn't it? Which seems to be like the theme of India's entire foreign policy these days.
You're absolutely right. It's a real tightrope walk, and it's made even more challenging by, the rapidly shifting global landscape.
As we're talking, it strikes me that this whole fighter jet saga is like a microcosm of the larger challenges and opportunities that India is facing, in the 21st century.
That's a great observation. On the one hand, India is this rising power, with a booming economy, a young and vibrant population, and a strong democratic tradition. They have the potential to be a major player on the world stage.
But on the other hand, they're surrounded by all these security threats. They're dealing with, internal social and economic challenges, and they're trying to navigate this really complex geopolitical landscape where the rules of the game seem to be constantly changing.
You've summed it up perfectly. And this fighter jet debate is a perfect illustration of, the tough choices and competing priorities that India has to grapple with.
It really underscores, the complexity of international relations
Yeah.
and the challenges faced by policymakers who are trying to make these strategic decisions with, long-term consequences.
Yes, absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and the rhetoric, but when you dig deeper, you realize that these are, multifaceted issues with no easy answers.
Yeah. Speaking of digging deeper, you mentioned earlier that India is exploring other options besides the F-35 in their domestic fighter programs. Can we talk a bit more about those? I'm particularly interested in the multi-role fighter aircraft program, the MRFA. What's the latest on that?
Oh, yeah, the MRFA. It's been kind of a roller coaster ride for that program. It was initially launched to acquire 114 foreign-built multi-role fighter jets through a transfer of technology agreement. The idea was to boost India's air power quickly while also gaining, valuable technological know-how that they could use to enhance their own domestic production capabilities.
So it sounds like a win-win, right? So what happened? Why haven't they moved forward with it?
Well, it's been stalled since 2019, mainly due to, bureaucratic hurdles, budgetary constraints, and difficulties in finalizing the technical specifications. But there are some signs that it might be revived soon, given, the urgency of India's fighter jet needs and the complexity surrounding the F-35 and the Make in India timelines.
So if they do revive the MRFA, who are like the main contenders, which jets are they looking at?
Well, there's a pretty impressive lineup of international heavyweights vying for this massive contract. Some of the top contenders include the Eurofighter Typhoon, a joint project between the UK, Germany, Italy, and Spain. The Dassault Rafale, a French-built multi-role jet that India has already purchased a smaller batch of the Boeing FA-18 Super Hornet, a tried-and-true American workhorse. And the Saab Gripen, a lightweight but highly capable fighter from Sweden.
Wow, that's quite a diverse field. It sounds like a really tough decision. How do they even begin to choose between all these different options?
It's a daunting task for sure. They have to
Right.
carefully evaluate, each jet's capabilities, its suitability for India's specific operational requirements, the terms of the technology transfer agreement, the political implications of choosing one country over another, and of course, the all-important cost factor.
It's amazing how something as seemingly straightforward as buying a fighter jet turns into this incredibly complex, calculus of strategic, economic, and even political considerations.
That's the nature of the game in international relations. Every decision has ripple effects, and countries like India have to carefully weigh their options to ensure they're maximizing, their national interests.
So with all these options on the table, the F-35, the Make in India route, the MRFA contenders, it seems like India is at a real crossroads. What do you think is the most likely scenario going forward?
Well, if I had a crystal ball, I'd be a very wealthy analyst.
Yeah.
But based on, my understanding of India's strategic priorities, their budgetary constraints, and the current geopolitical landscape, I think the most likely outcome is a kind of combination approach. They'll probably continue to pursue the Make in India vision for the long term while also looking for, short-term solutions to bolster their air power more immediately.
It's kind of a balancing act, just like their foreign policy in general.
Exactly. They might opt for a limited purchase of a foreign-built jet, like the Rafale or the Super Hornet, to plug, the most critical gaps in their capabilities, while simultaneously pushing forward with the development of the Tejas Mark II and the AMCA, their indigenous stealth fighter program.
So it sounds like they're trying to hedge their bets and keep their options open.
It's a smart strategy in a world that's, as unpredictable as ours. They don't want to put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. And they also want to send a clear message that India is a serious player in the global defense arena, both as a buyer and as a producer of, advanced military technology.
It's a fascinating story, and it makes you realize that even something as seemingly mundane as choosing a fighter jet can have these, profound implications for a country's security, its economy, and its place in the world.
You've hit the nail on the head. And that's what makes these deep dives so rewarding. We're not just scratching the surface, we're peeling back the layers to reveal, the complexities and the interconnectedness of global events.
Okay, so we've covered India's aging fleet, the F-35 offer, the Make in India vision, the MRFA contenders, and the whole Pakistan F-16 twist. Is there anything else we need to consider before we wrap up our deep dive into India's fighter jet dilemma?
There's actually one more crucial element that we haven't really touched on yet, the human factor.
The human factor. What do you mean?
I mean, the pilots who will be flying these jets, the engineers who will be maintaining them, the families who will be impacted by the decisions that are made. Behind all the, geopolitical maneuvering and the technological debates, there are real people whose lives are shaped by these choices.
That's a really important point. It's so easy to get lost in the abstractions, but ultimately these decisions have very real human consequences.
Exactly. So as you continue to follow this story, I encourage you to remember the human faces behind the headlines. Think about the individuals whose lives are intertwined with these events and, let that empathy inform your understanding of this complex issue.
That's a really good point. It's so easy to get caught up in the big picture, like the geopolitics and the economics and the technology, that we kind of forget about the human impact of these decisions.
It's true. We're talking about people's livelihoods, their safety, even their lives in some cases. So it's really important to keep that perspective in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we completely move on, I did want to touch on one more aspect of this whole, fighter jet debate, and that's the implications for India's defense industry and their push for, technological self-reliance.
Right. That's a key piece of the puzzle. India's Make in India initiative isn't just about boosting their economy. It's about reducing their dependence on foreign suppliers and becoming a major player in the global arms market.
Right, because developing a strong domestic defense industry is seen as like essential for achieving true, strategic autonomy.
Exactly. They don't want to be reliant on other countries for, their critical military hardware. They want to be able to design and build and maintain their own weapon systems, on their own terms.
But as we've been discussing, building a world-class defense industry that takes time and resources and a lot of technological know-how, it's not something you can just snap your fingers and do overnight.
You're absolutely right. And that's why this fighter jet dilemma is so challenging for India. They're trying to balance this urgent need to modernize their air force with the long-term goal of, building a self-sufficient defense sector.
So how do they strike that balance? What are some of the key challenges that they face in, nurturing their domestic defense industry?
Well, one of the biggest hurdles is that they just don't have a strong foundation yet in certain critical technologies. Designing and building these advanced fighter jets requires expertise in a lot of different areas, like aerospace engineering materials, science, propulsion systems, avionics, radar technology, and that's just to name a few.
Sounds like you need like a whole ecosystem of specialized skills and industries all working together.
Exactly, and that's something that India is still building. They've made progress in some areas, but there are definitely still gaps that need to be filled.
Yeah.
And then another challenge is just the bureaucracy, the red tape, and the often slow pace of decision making, in the Indian government.
Yeah, I've heard stories about projects getting bogged down in, layers of approvals and paperwork.
Yeah, it's a real problem. It can stifle innovation and make it difficult for companies to operate efficiently. And then on top of that, there's the issue of funding, developing advanced military technology. It's incredibly expensive. And India has to make some tough choices about where to allocate its resources.
Right, especially with all the other demands on their budget, like education, healthcare infrastructure development. It's a real juggling act.
It is. And then you can't forget about the global competition. India isn't the only country trying to build up its defense industry. They're going up against, the established players like the US, Russia, China, Europe, all of whom are vying for a share of that international arms market.
So it's not just about, building a good fighter jet. It's about building a better fighter jet than your competitors and doing it at a price that's attractive to buyers.
That's the name of the game, and it's a tough game to win, but India does have some advantages. They have this large and growing pool of skilled engineers and scientists. They have relatively low labor costs, and they have a strong government commitment to supporting the Make in India initiative.
So it sounds like they have the potential to be a real force in the global defense industry. But they also face some pretty steep challenges.
You've got it. It's a long-term project, and it's going to require sustained effort and some smart investments to achieve their goals.
Well, I'm definitely going to be keeping an eye on this story. It's fascinating to see how India is trying to, forge its own path in the world, both in terms of its military capabilities and its economic aspirations.
It is a remarkable story, and it's unfolding right now as we speak. And, as we've seen, it's a story with many layers, many twists and turns, and a lot of implications for the future of the region and, really the whole world.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us. I know our listeners have gained a much deeper understanding of India's, fighter jet dilemma and all the complexities that surround it.
It's been my pleasure. And to our listeners, as you continue to read and learn about this topic, remember the story is always evolving. So keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and keep connecting the dots. That's how you become, truly well-informed.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. And with that, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us. And as always, keep